Hi everybody, this is Skip Alzheimer of AV Geeks. Welcome to our lunchtime streaming show. I'm really tired. Actually, we're both tired. My wife and I both spent the day going through boxes and boxes of VHS and DVDs. Found a lot of great stuff, and we're back at the hotel room, and we're exhausted. So exhausted that this is actually my third time that I've tried to record this intro. The first time I streamed it, the second time I didn't have the right thing on. So I'm exhausted. But let me just tell you about the two films we're about to watch. They're both by the Moody Institute of Science, who I've shown some films from before. It's my favorite religious science film company, mostly because of what they capture and what they show, not because of the science that they aren't really telling you about. So the first film is Food Getting Among Animals. The second one is Dust or Destiny. The first one was made for schools to be sent to public schools. The second one is more of a sermons from science. It's something that Dr. Irwin Moon did before he kind of teamed up with the Moody Institute of Science. Like, he would tour around and do these science experiments, and then he would bring out a Bible and start talking about the gospel. And so this one is going to talk more about Jesus, and there's going to be some gospel in it. And the one that's made for schools is going to mention God, probably. I can't remember specifically. But I think at the time they thought, like, well, we can talk about God because everybody in school believes in God, like whether you're Protestant, Catholic, or Jewish. I mean, that covers all of them, right? So they got away with that in the 50s and 60s, but not in the 70s. So enjoy these two films, and I'll talk a little bit about them at the end.
Hungry? Well, who isn't? Appetite seems to be one thing every living creature has in common. The eating habits of animals is one of the most diverse studies in nature. God has employed a seemingly endless variety of physical differences. The jungle is full of strange animals with odd eating habits. This creature looks like he has a tail on both ends. It's an anteater. His main diet is termites and ants. His long, razor-sharp claws are a hindrance to walking, but just the tool he needs for tearing open old stump trunks loaded with termites. Digging termites out of their narrow tunnels would be an impossible task for most animals. The anteater has exactly the right equipment: a long, slender, sticky tongue. He thrusts it deep into the termite burrows, trapping the ants and termites on its sticky surface and drawing them back into its mouth. The suspenders, by the way, have nothing to do with keeping his trousers up. They just happen to be unusual markings on this altogether unusual animal. The powerful claws and strong prehensile tail are equally helpful when the anteater dines in the trees. There seems to be no lack of ants in his pantry. The anteater, equipped in a remarkable way to live exclusively on insects. For many years, man has known that rattlesnakes could, in some strange, mysterious manner, find their prey in the dark. But how? In a sense, the rattlesnake has two sets of eyes, and the organ that sees in the dark is an ape or depression on either side of the head. Dr. Raymond C. Coles and Dr. Theodore H. Bullock of the University of California at Los Angeles have contributed much to the world's new knowledge of this strange phenomenon. The method employed in obtaining this information is a unique and interesting experiment. Dr. Coles milks the rattler of its venom. Dr. Bullock anesthetizes the reptile. The snake is blindfolded, depriving him of sight in the realm of visible light. Platinum electrodes are connected to the nerves coming from the pit organ so that the tiny signals flashed from the organ to the snake's brain can be intercepted. These signals are amplified so that they may be heard on a loudspeaker or recorded on a graph recorder. And now for the test. The snake is obviously excited by the human hand. A warm-blooded animal has crossed its path. The snake can see the invisible infrared rays from the heat of a human hand. An ice cube is of little interest to the rattler. Why? Well, an animal that cold would be dead. Lighting a match in front of the snake is like turning on a searchlight of infrared rays. The recorder shows a sudden violent reaction. A piece of special heat-absorbing glass cuts off the rays, and the snake's reaction stops. The pit viper, night prowler of the desert and mountainside, marvelously equipped by the Creator to find its necessary food on the darkest night. The ocean is a veritable sea soup. The abundance of microscopic plant and animal life is quite beyond measure. There are a number of creatures in the ocean very well fitted for straining seawater of its microscopic inhabitants. One of these is the barnacle. It is found on rocks along the shore and on wharf pilings in prodigious numbers. They remain permanently fixed in one place, fastened by means of a leathery stalk called a gooseneck. But the main part of its body is encased in a protective shell. When the barnacle is covered by the rising tide, the shell pops open, and the legs of the animal, looking like feathered ostrich plumes, are thrust out to trap tiny plants and animals. These invisible creatures are strained from the water by the feather-like fish net. When the legs, called cirri, are drawn back into the shell, the captured food is carried deep inside to its mouth. One zoologist described the barnacle as an animal that stands on its head and kicks food into its mouth with its feet. Have you ever seen the fish that spits? The archerfish has a good reason for its odd behavior. It's shooting for game. A stream of water is shot from the fish's mouth like a bullet. The prey is stunned by the force of the water and drops to the surface below. The spitting fish seldom misses the target. The archerfish has an unusual problem, the very serious one of refraction. Because the fish is under the water, he sees the insect where it isn't. Have you ever tried to shoot fish? If you have, you know it's practically impossible. For a fish to make all the split-second computations necessary to hit the target would seem utterly fantastic, wouldn't it? But the archerfish does it, time and time again. Marksmanship we cannot attribute to its own reason or intelligence. Again, our little creature has been endowed by the Creator with an innate skill for obtaining food that would be completely out of its reach. is the only animal in the world that can lasso its food more than a body's length away without moving. The eyes are another example of unusual equipment. They are mounted in ball turrets, and one sight organ is able to rotate independently of the other. While one eye is searching for an enemy, the other eye is searching for a bite to eat. When the tasty prey is sighted, the eyes work in unison, probably to improve the aim of the tongue. The skin of the chameleon is a heavy plate of armor. And it's not only tough, it's made up of an amazing cell structure that enables the chameleon a moment's notice. Camouflage is as old as life itself. These baby chameleons are just a few hours old, and already they're on their own, making immediate use of all that God has given them, from the tiny ball turret eyes to the feet, the tongue, and the tail. Imagine something like this happening to you when you were just a few hours old. To the chameleon, it's all a part of this wonderful new life. No formulas or bottles are necessary. When the tiny reptile feels the need for sustenance, he simply helps himself. A grasshopper is a giant compared to the baby chameleon, but the little fellows show no fear. Perhaps they realize that someday a grasshopper will be nothing more than a bite to eat. Everywhere in nature, we see the unmistakable evidence of God's creative wisdom. The eating habits of his creatures are among those commonplace things that speak so eloquently of God's design and thoughtfulness. God has provided for our needs, too, in a very special way. He has not only provided for our physical needs, but our spiritual hunger as well. For he has declared, "Man shall not live by bread alone, but by every word that proceedeth out of the mouth of God." live in a wonderful world. A world crowded with beauty. A world of grandeur, mystery. Yes, this is a wonderful world. But perhaps the greatest wonder of all is man himself. His body is a marvel of mechanical efficiency and adaptability. The body has a chemical plant, far more complex and efficient than any man has ever built. It transforms the food we eat into flesh and blood and bones and teeth. And the body has a heating system, a living furnace that we stoke daily with food for fuel. As this fuel is oxidized, heat and energy are provided for the body machine. In winter, we're kept warm by this remarkable system, and in the summer, we're kept cool by the body's own cooling system, which is so efficient it can prevent our body temperature from rising for a limited time, even in heat that will fry a steak. An automatic thermostat controls both our heating and our cooling systems, keeping our temperature at a normal 98.6 degrees, except when a higher temperature is needed to combat disease. More than the greatest ever constructed by man. The body's telephone system transmits millions of messages every day with never a busy signal or wrong number. Man-made machines require lubrication from an outside source, but the body manufactures its own lubricant in just the right grade and the right amount for every part. Yes, the body is wonderful. The hand, for example, is a marvel of mechanical adaptability. It can perform a multitude of tasks. Oh, man has been able to make a mechanical hand that will feed a printing press, but that hand can't thread a needle, or perform an operation, or paint a picture. The human hand can perform all these activities and thousands more. There's no doubt but what man needed a hand just like this. But was the need alone enough to bring it into existence? Still more wonderful is the human eye. The camera, man's nearest mechanical approach to the eye, resembles it in many ways. For any camera, whether it's a tiny model small enough to fit into your vest pocket, or a giant aerial camera, has a lens, similar in design and function to the lens of the human eye. Sometimes the eye lens becomes damaged or clouded and requires surgery. And here, in an actual operation, the eye lens is removed, and we see what a perfect little optical instrument it is. The eye functions far more efficiently than the lens of the most expensive camera. When a lens is focused on an object at a given distance and that distance is changed, the object becomes blurred, and the lens must be refocused to the new distance. In the camera, this focusing must be done by hand, but in the eye, it's automatic. Strong muscles change the focus thousands of times each day without a thought on our part. The camera also has a means for controlling the amount of light that reaches the film, an iris diaphragm, copied from and named after the iris of the human eye, which automatically changes according to light. Now, the pictures the eye gives us are not black and white. They're color pictures. And they're not stills. They're motion pictures. And they're not silent. They're sound pictures. Do you know that the music you're hearing is being played all over again on a perfect little musical instrument inside your ear? We think of the sound as being produced by the piano, and of course in one sense it is. But actually the piano is as silent as a tomb and is merely producing vibrations in the air. As the keys are struck, felt hammers strike the strings, causing them to vibrate, each at its own frequency. The vibrating strings set the air pulsating to the same frequencies. These pulsations are transmitted to the outer ear, down the auditory canal, and through the mechanical linkage of the middle ear to the cochlea, which is all rolled up like a cockle shell. If the cochlea could be stretched out, we would discover a musical instrument similar to the piano, but far more wonderful and complex. The ear has more than 24,000 strings. These two notes are as close as any the piano can produce. But the ear's piano can produce 10 tones between these two and more than 1,500 different tones altogether. When the piano is played, the ear's remarkable little keyboard plays the same tones and sends corresponding signals along individual lines to the brain. Of course, the outer ear operates in air, but the cochlea is filled with a liquid. The transmission of sound from air to a liquid is one of the most difficult problems, but in the ear, this problem is beautifully solved by the mechanical preciseness of the middle ear, with its 2 diaphragms of just the right size, and 3 connecting bones with the exact leverage required. The eardrum is like a piston. It has an area of 90 square millimeters. The smaller diaphragm an area of 3.2 square millimeters. Diaphragms must be joined by a mechanical leverage of 2 to 1. In the ear, these tiny bones, the ossicles, are exactly right for the job. They are a fixed size that must not change from the cradle to the grave. The little fellow has a lot of growing to do before he's as big as Dad. All the bones in his body must grow and develop. All, that is, but the ossicles of his ears. They have to be the right size at the start and never change throughout life. These are the actual bones from the ear of an adult and a child. Can it be just an accident that they are the only bones in a baby's body that do not grow, that are fully developed at birth? The ear is one of the most efficient sound detectors known to man, capable of hearing the roar of a cannon or the rustle of leaves, and under ideal conditions, even the footfalls of a cat. But at the University of California at Los Angeles, there is a place where we can hear sounds so soft that the footfalls of a cat would seem deafening by comparison. Deep in the sub-basement of the physics building, far below the surface of the Earth, is a most unusual room where it is possible to study the amazing sensitivity of the human ear. Here we find ourselves shut off from extraneous outside noises, surrounded by prisms of spun glass that absorb incidental sounds such as our own breathing. It takes time for our senses to become adjusted to the absence of familiar sounds in this strange environment. But before long, we hear noises we never really heard before. The sound of air molecules beating against our eardrums. The sound of our heart pounding against our ribs. Did you ever see a living, beating human heart? A rare operation enables us to see this marvelous little pump. It pumps 12 pints of blood through hundreds of thousands of miles of blood vessels every minute, and in one day pumps enough blood to fill a large gasoline truck to overflowing. During a lifespan, it would fill a string of tank cars 50 miles long and beat 2.5 million times without a single shutdown for repairs. Have you ever wondered what goes on in the brain of a homing pigeon? Somewhere within its tiny head is locked a secret no man has ever solved. A secret that enables it to take to the air long distances from home, circle about a few minutes and get its bearings in some mysterious way, and then fly straight home over long miles of unfamiliar territory. Because of the pigeon's strange homing ability, pigeon raising has become a popular hobby. This hand-fed youngster doesn't look much like the expert flyer he will someday be. And yet, even at this early age, he's banded with a number that will identify him through racing days. As soon as the young are able to fly, they are released from the home loft on daily training flights. Like athletes, they must build up their speed and endurance through many weeks of strenuous training. The training flights are short at first, with the birds circling about overhead only a few minutes and then returning to the landing porch. But as they grow older and stronger, they're ready for longer flights and are transported many miles from the home loft. Here they are released to wing their way home over a path they have never seen. Then, at last, the 500-mile race. The birds are watered just before dawn to sustain them on their long journey home. And at sunrise, Pigeondom's greatest race classic gets underway as thousands of experienced flyers take to the air. No one ever taught these birds the way home. No one ever showed them the path they should take. And yet so unerringly do they wing their way across hundreds of unfamiliar miles that the time of their arrival home can be predicted almost exactly. But pigeons are small-time operators compared with the Pacific golden plover, a bird rarely seen outside of our field museums. This feathered globetrotter flies so far it needs 2 suits of clothes, one for Arctic weather and the other for tropical wear. It lives and mates in eastern Siberia and Alaska, but it winters in the Hawaiian Islands. In late summer, the adult birds make the long migration journey, traveling 2,000 miles over open sea. Without stopping for food or rest, they fly unerringly to these pinpoint islands in the vast Pacific. Junior's left at home because he's too young to make the trip. But many weeks later, as soon as he's able to fly, he too feels the urge to migrate, and he sets out for a goal he has never seen. To reach it, he must fly 2,000 miles over an unmarked... They've never made the trip before either. But what prompts the golden plover to set out for a place he has never seen? Just think what would happen if navigation were off and he missed those tiny islands. The migration flight of the American plover is even more amazing. It travels from northern Canada to Labrador and then across 2,000 miles of pathless seas without a stop and on down to Argentina. The journey home is by a different route, and again the young, making the trip for the first time, fly these thousands of miles unaccompanied by any bird that has ever made the trip before. But the greatest migrant of all is the Arctic tern. Starting from within 8 degrees of the North Pole, it spans more than 11,000 miles in a record-breaking flight to the South Pole. After a brief period within the Antarctic Circle, it makes the long return trip, to complete the world's longest migration flight, 22,000 miles over unfamiliar land and sea. To keep a modern plane on its course requires an array of complicated instruments, charts, plotters, and celestial navigation equipment.
Long Beach, clear, scattered clouds at 3,500, visibility 8, temperature 60, dew point 48, altimeter 2988, winds west-southwest 13.
Clover Tower, this is NC 275. Landing instructions, please. Over.
NC 275, this is Clover Tower, runway 30, cleared to land.
Clover Tower, NC 275, turning final. What is it in this tiny head that all the ingenuity of man cannot duplicate? Say, what's this? Something out of a nightmare? Could be if you dream of bats. The bat is a mysterious creature, the only mammal that flies. Like other mammals, it bears its young alive and suckles them at its breast. This is typical bat country. Only a bat could feel at home here, but rents are reasonable and bat apartments easy to find. That is, for bats they are. But scientists spend long hours searching for the bat hideouts. And the main object of their interest, the bat's remarkable abilities in flight. At dusk, final preparations are made for technical Institute of Science, the bats quickly become adjusted to their new environment. Normally, these bats feed on insects they catch on the wing. But in the lab, they'll settle for anything we can dig up. Mickey was an orphan when we found him, but he quickly became the lab pet. Somehow, he had his own ideas about food. Even a doll's nursing bottle wasn't much of an attraction at first. But it wasn't long before Mickey felt right at home with his bottle. And in a few short days, the two were inseparable. But life isn't all worms and nursing bottles in a science lab. There's work to be done, even for bats. These bats never served in the Army, but they know what an obstacle course is. The bat's wing spread far exceeds the space between the crossbars. Only clever maneuvering will permit him to fly between them. As the bat is released, we cross our fingers and hope he'll do what the book says. Now watch this. Bats are not blind. They have eyes and they can see. But the key to the bat's success in avoiding obstacles is not his ability to see. To prove it, we'll blindfold him and put him through another test. Blindfolded, he dodges those bars just as skillfully as he did before. But how does he do it? Well, science knows that bats emit strange cries in flight. They can't be picked up by the ordinary microphone. They're far beyond the range of the human ear. But a very special high-frequency amplifier tuned to 32,000 cycles for this particular bat translates these inaudible sounds into sounds we can hear. Through numerous experiments, science learned that the bat's ears are extremely sensitive to high-pitched sounds. And the question arose, can the bat's own cries be signals that guide it in flight? Well, let's tie the bat's mouth closed so he can't make these sounds and see what happens. Incidentally, here's the only creature we know that can get into trouble by keeping his mouth shut. Science has proved conclusively that bats are guided in flight by echoes of their signal cries. Why, that's actually a kind of radar. Man's radar takes tons of equipment and a large crew of men to operate it. But the bat carries its remarkable radar around in its head. Radar that guides it safely through the intense darkness of the caves, that keeps it from colliding with obstacles it cannot see, or with the thousands of other bats flying through the same darkness. How did the bat learn to use radar so many ages before it was even a dream in the mind of man? Where did the bat get such marvelous equipment? Obviously, this is all a part of an intelligent plan, but whose intelligence? The bat's? If we were to visit the beaches of Southern California on certain spring and summer evenings, we'd find them dotted with campfires. But the people around these fires are not picnickers. Believe it or not, these folks are fishing. Yes, grunion fishing. And by tradition, the hot dogs and the marshmallows are all a part of this unusual sport. But now it's H hour on grunion night. And here comes the lookout shouting, "Hey, grunion, come on, come on!" And they're off in the strangest sport on earth. But wait a minute. Where's the fishing tackle? You can't fish without poles or nets, or can you? It looks like all you need for this kind of fishing is a reckless enthusiasm and a good boarding house grab. Oh yes, and a bucket. You'd really have some fun trying to carry an armload of these fellas. Yes, and dry clothes to go home in are a must for grunion fishermen. Because in the excitement, something like this always seems to happen. Fish out of water. Yes, and these fish haven't been washed up on the beach by accident. They deliberately come out of the water to lay their eggs on shore. The only fish in the world that spawn on land. Fish nesting on land, one of the rarest of all biological phenomena. A spectacle so unique it can be witnessed nowhere in the world except on a few Southern California beaches. Fish depend upon water for life, just as we depend upon air. And yet at the very risk of its life, the grunion comes out of the water into this foreign, hostile environment. Here, the female digs into the sand, tail first, and lays her eggs. Once they are fertilized, the desperate struggle for survival begins. If she misses the next wave, she has little chance to survive. The eggs are always laid when the water is far up on the beach. Then, night after night, the waters recede until they reach the lowest tide. By then, the eggs may be hundreds of feet from the water's edge, far from the element in which the fish must eventually live. Here the eggs develop, lying buried in the warm, moist sand. On the beaches of Southern California in the early spring or summer, it's possible to find these eggs by digging almost anywhere along the high tide line. Careful searching uncovers tiny pockets of these brightly colored eggs. In the photomicrographic laboratory of the Moody Institute of Science, the embryonic development, which normally takes place under the sand, is studied with the microscope. These eggs were fertilized only seconds ago, and now one is being prepared for observation. Within this tiny egg, a miracle is about to take place. With the aid of the lapse-time photomicrographic equipment, which compresses days into seconds on the screen, we will be able to witness this amazing spectacle, the magical unfolding of life through cell division. The first faint stirrings of life come when the blastodermal cap, seen in the circle, divides into two separate cells. In about 30 minutes, the second cleavage becomes evident, resulting in 4 cells. Successive divisions produce 8, 16, 32, 64, and so on up into the hundreds of thousands of cells. This formless cluster is actually a fish in the making. It contains all the characteristics of the adult grunion: its size, its shape, its habits, yes, even the germ of that mysterious wisdom by which it will someday be able to perfectly time its spawning with the movement of the tides. Food for the growing embryonic fish is supplied by numerous globules of oil in the center of the egg. With every surge, the cells divide until eventually there will be millions upon millions of them, each having just as much claim to being the original cell as any of the millions of others. And yet they're all different. Soon they will take their place in the various parts of the body as bones and blood and scales and fins. Out of this indistinguishable mass of cells in some mysterious, unknown way, the form of a fish is building up around an invisible, intangible framework. But where is the mold or the pattern that is shaping these cells into a living creature? The first recognizable features are the head and the eyes. And the first action of the fish, controlled by its newly formed muscles, is revealed by the lapse-time camera as a series of convulsive jerks. The head and the eyes are more plainly visible now, and on the opposite side of the egg, the tail is beginning to form. At this stage of its growth, the embryonic fish is 4 days old. The head and the eyes are well formed now, and the simple heart already at work can be seen. After 8 to 10 days, the egg is ready to hatch. But remember, when it does, it will be a fish. If it were to hatch while buried here in the sand, far from the water, it wouldn't have a chance in the world to live. But the grunion egg never hatches until the water reaches it, and then it hatches instantly. Now, you can keep these eggs buried in the sand for weeks or months, and they won't hatch. But now let's pour some salt water on them and see what happens. This mysterious hatching of the egg is just as definitely connected with the movement of the tides as is the spawning. There are two main tides which have their peak at the full and the dark of the moon. This complex pattern represents the rise and fall of the daily tides over a period of a month. Suppose the eggs were laid any night before the peak tide. A higher tide the following night would wash them out of the sheltering sand and expose them to their enemies. Or, if they were laid on a night too long after the peak, they would be washed out by a rising tide just a few nights later, before they had a chance to develop. Actually, there are only a few nights when the grunion can lay her eggs successfully, when the tide is at its peak, or the first few nights after the peak. And she must choose not only the right night, but the right hour of that night. For even if she should lay her eggs on the right night, but when the tide is still rising, they would be washed out by that very tide. Or if she should wait too long after the peak and lay her eggs while that night's tide is receding, they would be washed out by the rising tide of the next night and destroyed. Only during this magic hour can the eggs be laid where they will grow and develop safely. But that isn't all. For during this hour, certain waves are higher than others. So the grunion has to choose not only the right month, the right night of that month, and the right hour of that night, but when the right wave during that hour. Terrible and treacherous are the tides. The story of their treachery is told in warning markers along many a fog-bound rocky coast. No sea captain can guide his vessel safely without a knowledge of the tides. But the grunion possesses a far better knowledge of the tides than the most experienced mariner, and is able to turn these tides, so destructive to man, to its own advantage, and by them preserve its very life and the life of its young. Remember that first garden you had when you were a youngster? You planted the seeds and covered them so carefully. You rather expected the plants to pop out of the ground like this, but somehow it didn't work out quite that way. And as you waited, you got to wondering, well, maybe I planted those seeds upside down. Well, is there a right and a wrong end to a seed? On opening a bean seed, we find that the embryonic root points in a definite direction. This determines the direction of initial growth. So it is possible to plant a seed upside down. But no matter which way the seed is placed in the ground, the plant always grows in the right direction. Even if we try to fool the growing seed, it doesn't get mixed up. The root reverses it. If we turn a growing plant on its side, the stem will grow upward, even if it has to bend at right angles to do so. Of course, the root grows down, because down is the logical place to find water. But if it encounters a dry region like the red area, it limits its growth to the area of moisture. Now, the shoot grows up because up is the logical place to find the light it must have. But if light can't be found by growing upward, the shoot will grow in any direction to reach it, even if it has to detour through a small hole to get there. Plant two seeds at the same time. Grow one in the light, the other in the dark. The one in the light soon has well-developed leaves, but the one in the dark has wasted no energy in developing leaves, which would be useless in the dark. It has expended all of its energy in a frantic effort to reach the light. This is the principle that causes a tree to defy the law of gravity. Have you ever paused to consider the enormous forces at work in a single tree? This tree is probably the oldest living thing on earth. It was almost 2,000 years old when Christ was born. For 3,800 years, this tree has been lifting at least 10 tons of water each day to its top. A total of more than 10 trillion foot-pounds of work. It is evident that there is an infinite power behind the mystery of life. But is this a blind, unintelligent, impersonal force?
Well, you've been thinking, haven't you? That's all right. Don't feel embarrassed. It's a good thing. It's good to think once in a while about things like where you came from and why you're here, maybe about where you're going. Now about that matter of origin. No doubt you formed some opinion as to where you came from. Well, let's look at it this way. Suppose that you've never seen and you've never heard of a watch. And then one day you find one. You're intrigued by its appearance and by that strange sound it makes. If you're anything like the rest of us, it isn't long before you have the back off trying to find out what makes it tick. Now you're still more intrigued with the intricate wonders of that mechanism. If you're observant, it isn't long before you notice that there's a definite relationship between the movement of those hands and the passage of time. You discover that you have a useful article. But now you've got to explain the origin of the watch. Well, you might develop the theory that the watch just happened, especially if you were trying to convince yourself that nobody owned the watch. You could argue that the atoms and the molecules of the various parts just got together by accident. But the simplest kind of reasoning should tell you that somebody made those parts. Somebody put them together for a purpose. Well, how about that eye with its automatic focus and light control? Or that tiny musical instrument inside the human ear? Or that heart with its endless capacity for work? Or the bat with its radar magic? Or the directional wizardry of birds in flight? Or the grunion egg with its tiny cells building life about a ghost-like frame? Or the seeking wonder of growing things? Is all this the product of blind chance? You know, when you come right down to it, there are only two views we can take. Either this all happened by accident, or it's the result of design and plan. You might just shrug your shoulders and say, well, it's just a matter of personal opinion, and let it go at that. You might, that is, but for the fact that this is an issue which vitally affects your whole life. It's going to determine how you think and how you live. For after all, if man is just an accident, then he has no responsibility except that responsibility is upon himself. There's no law but the law of convenience and desire. There's no ultimate right or wrong. And when people think and live according to that philosophy, the result is chaos. But if, on the other hand, there's a plan, then there's a planner. If there's a design, there's a designer. In other words, there's a God. You know, it isn't hard to believe in a God. It's the simplest and the most logical thing in the world. Oh, I know that some people are honestly confused by the maze of conflicting arguments. I guess maybe they just try to make the thing too hard. But for a lot of people, the problem gets complicated only when they begin to worry about who owns the watch. In other words, believing in God involves a responsibility, and they don't want that responsibility. They don't want anybody telling them what's right or what's wrong or how to live or act, not even the God who made them. But when you get as many people as there are in the world today living and acting as if there were no God, it's no wonder the world's in a mess. When we see the results of unbelief, it doesn't seem at all far-fetched to say that the only hope for the world as a whole, or for you as an individual, is faith in God. Not just belief in a supreme being or a great force, but belief in a personal God who loved you enough to provide a salvation for you. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son, that whosoever believeth in him should not perish, but have everlasting life.
That Dust or Destiny is great. I mean, it's a longer film, but the footage in there is just stunning. Beautiful stuff that Dr. Moon, he was an amateur photographer as well as an amateur scientist. And he set up some of these amazing shots with his team. A lot of beautiful time-lapse photography. Slow motion photography of that bat was really phenomenal. And just really kind of brought these beautiful images to people. And I think it really influenced kids to be scientists, actually. It also, I think, personally, kind of planted the seeds for intelligent design a little bit, which talks about, an intelligent designer who created these things with this plan in mind, that it wasn't just random evolution, that it was actually something that was planned out. So I have a lot of these films, and they're really quite entertaining for me, even though I know that they go on a sharp departure from actually talking about science concepts. But I'm exhausted, and so I'll be back again tomorrow. Thanks for tuning in. If you'd like to buy some coffee, go to ko-fi.com/avgeeks. You can also hit the like button or the thumbs up button or the share button or the subscribe button. Any of those things will help tell the world that you like AV Geeks. And thank you for tuning in, and we'll see you soon. Bye-bye.